Welcome, welcome, everyone. We are here with 𝐟𝐨𝐫𝐬𝐻, who I had the pleasure to meet in the back green room, I believe, if I recall, of the Dr. Oz show. And I remember seeing you on screen and thinking, wow, who is this woman? You were funny, you were real. And of course, later I learned that you had this show called Let's Get Real. So anyway, I'm so excited that we could have you in this program. And just for listeners and viewers who are new to your work, I'm just going to tell people a little bit about your background. Okay. 𝐿 is a professional chef, a cooking teacher, food media host, and a commercial actor. She's been in the food industry for over 25 years, first in New York City restaurants and later as an instructor at the Institute of Culinary Education. She created and hosted Let's Get Real on the Heritage Radio Network for 7 years, and that's how I know your work. And also the creator and host of Funny People Making Food, a food and comedy mashup series on both YouTube and Instagram. And we have watched it and it is hilarious. So everybody should tune into that. So welcome. We're so happy to have you here.
Yeah. And then we met on Dr. Oz, and then you invited me to be on at TEDx.
At the TEDx Berkeley, yeah. Which
amazing.
Yeah, that was super fun. But anyway, I mean, the Let's Get Real part, I think that's what blew me away. And I know you're not doing that show anymore, but it's fundamental to how you think about food and what we put in our body.
Right.
Was there a catalyst for that? Was there sort of an aha moment where you were like, okay, I'm more than a chef. There's something else going on.
Well, I started out working in restaurants, and, when you work in restaurants, it's, you're around like-minded people who understand the importance of eating, real food as opposed to processed, packaged, garbage, and customers who are there because that's what they want. And then when I transitioned into teaching, after about, 7 years in the industry, I needed a break. So I started teaching. And I was teaching culinary school. Like, I was teaching people who, said, I want to be a chef. I want to be in this business. And I started to notice that a lot of my students were just clueless about food, not just it wasn't that they just didn't know about high-end stuff. They knew nothing. They knew nothing about nutrition. They knew nothing about food, about where it comes from, what it is, what it means, And I think the actual catalyst was one day, one of my students came in for a class that started at 1, and they often would bring their lunch and, come in early and sit. And she had brought a package of Lunchables, that pre-made stuff for little kids, the most processed shit you can buy and feed to children. And this was an adult, she was in her 20s, and she brought in this package of Lunchables. And I looked at her and I was like, what are you eating? And she goes, oh, it's so good. These are great. And I said, you're in culinary school. You're learning about, the best food, making the best food possible. Why are you eating that? And she was like, oh, they're really good. I like them. My little brother eats them. And I said, do you not realize what utter garbage that is? And she's like, no, it's really good. And that something snapped in me. And I was like, okay, there's a total disconnect here. People are not learning. I mean, we've all always known for decades and decades that, America is the land of the processed packaged crap. But this was this crazy, weird, I don't even know how to phrase it, but just a total disconnect. This, young woman who was in culinary school was sitting there eating this thing. We all have our favorite, junk snack, whatever. But she had no sense of the fact that what she was eating was literally just garbage.
It's not real food even.
Yeah, not even real food. Yeah, if she had a little thing with real cheese and salami and crackers, which is what it was, it would have been okay, So I was just horrified by that. And then I really started just thinking about just all of that, just how was it that this person had, sort of spent her $50,000 to go to culinary school, but also thought this was totally acceptable. And then Marion Nestle, who's a very famous food writer, she writes about food and politics and our food system. She came in one day to do a talk with the faculty for Faculty Development Day. And she really opened my eyes about how in bed big food is with the government, like about, corn subsidies and the Farm Bill, and how, the USDA, which we think of as this like very kind of, upstanding Department of Agriculture, government agency, is really just like the marketing arm of big food and big pharma. And like, light bulbs were going off in my head. Like, she really opened my eyes to that. And then she also was talking a lot about how the food industry creates these sort of, faux healthy products, like what I think Michael Pollan coined the term a health halo, so things like, power bars and protein enhanced water and like all of these, it's just all the same processed junk, but they put this health halo on it and then sell it to you as something, so much better or even better than real food or something like that. And that's where the idea for Let's Get Real came from, because I started to really see just this avalanche of these products of, things that were completely deceiving people and making them think that buying the processed crap was okay, as long as it had the health halo, it was like potentially even better than real food. So it's a very long answer, but that's kind of where it all started with Let's Get Real. I had previously been doing a show on Heritage Radio called Why We Cook, which was more of sort of like your traditional like NPR style, musings on food and seasonality and recipes and stuff like that. And that was fun, but I felt like I really needed to like sort of dig into this world of what I then coined foodiness. And so I, finished doing Why We Cook, and I developed Let's Get Real with, I was working with kind of a co-producer for a while, this guy, Chris Nutter, who was he in the green? No, you didn't meet him. They wouldn't let me bring anyone to the green room, so he wasn't there. But he's a writer and sort of PR guy, and he really helped me come up with the concept and create this idea. So that's where Let's Get Real came from. Yeah. And then when I did my TEDx talk, that's what I talked about.
Yeah. And it was a really great program. And I think, it was at that time that people who were conscious of being healthy were starting to really rethink things, right? And some of this stuff started coming out, but not enough of it was coming out, and especially in the mainstream media.
Yeah. Well, the mainstream media relies on ad money from big food, big pharma. So they're not going to really break those sorts of stories, and that was actually always the thing. Like, I was always very critical of all sorts of brands and companies and products on the show. And my husband would be like, if you ever want to get any sort of like sponsor dollars for this show, he's like, no one's going to touch you because of what you're saying. And I was like, well, I don't know what to do. I'm not going to like whitewash it or anything, but yeah. But this term foodiness, we kind of came up with. I mean, you have to be old enough to remember the administration of George W. Bush Jr. And I think it was Colbert who came up with this term truthiness, which is like what the George W. Bush administration was doing, where if they just kept saying something enough times to the public, it would become, truth, like, 9/11, Al-Qaeda, weapons of mass destruction. They've just sort of kept conflating things until it became like lore, until people were like, oh yeah, that must be true. And so Colbert started calling it truthiness. And so we came up with foodiness, which is like the truthiness of food, where, if big food says to you, you should be eating, trying to think of like a really bad foodiness product. Like at the time I was all over like smart water, if they're saying, oh, you should drink this smart water because it's infused with like electrolytes and special things and magic, and it's going to make you smarter or calmer or whatever, the more they said it, the more you were like, oh, I guess I can't drink tap water. I have to drink smart water, in a plastic bottle. So like that. So that's what foodiness is.
Was there a moment where you realized that the avalanche of plastics, being ingested by not just animals, fish, but people were also kind of being hidden?
I don't really think there was a moment. I mean, I think the awareness of that has sort of been gradually building and building, and it's kind of steamrolled now. But what's really horrifying is, like, it's not just the plastic pollution in the world and the microplastics that we're all ingesting and that are everywhere. They're in the air, they're in the water, but it's also the chemicals that leach out of the plastic into your food. So, like if you put something acidic in a plastic container or something with alcohol, or, the food is going to leach the chemicals into the food. And the chemicals are these things called endocrine disruptors, which are, really messing with everybody's endocrine system. And so, it like screws with your hormones. It's why, like 9-year-old girls are going into puberty, and, young boys are having, all sorts of problems, and infertility is on the rise. And so much of that, all those hormonal endocrine related things, can be traced back to the prevalence of these chemicals. And they're not just in food, they're in packaging and cosmetics and hair dye and carpets and, anything with plasticizers. We're just drowning in them. Like when I teach, I don't allow any nonstick pans to be used in my classroom. I tell all my students, like, I'm going to teach you how to cook the way people cooked 100 years ago, before nonstick pans were invented, because people have been cooking since we harnessed fire and figured out that our food tasted better if we put it in the fire. They've been cooking without nonstick pans, and you can too. Yeah. Actually, I have my friend who lives in Oakland. She wrote a whole book about endocrine disruptors in food. So you should have her on an episode. She'd be great.
Oh, great. Yeah, great. Yeah, we'd love to learn more about that, because I do think, even though, like you said, the avalanche of, plastic bottles, or at least plastic water bottles, everyone's aware now, right? And it's just getting stronger and stronger. But I still think there is not that much awareness about other products and stuff that leaks into our system slowly, right? Like even toothpaste.
I want to kind of put you on the spot a little bit with the endocrine system. By profession, I'm a pediatric speech and language pathologist. So I work with children with autism, a lot of children with autism. And during my 25 years, I've seen an increase in autism a great deal. Now, firstly, we can identify autism much more now than we could 25 years ago. But do you think, in your professional opinion, that the plastics that we cook with, that we breathe in, that we ingest, do you think there's a relationship between this increase in autism due to the intake of all of these different plastic chemicals that we're ingesting?
I mean, I'm not a medical professional. I'm just a chef and cooking teacher, but I can't see how it doesn't. Like, I can't say for sure, but I can't imagine that it's not. We're bathing in a soup of chemicals that humanity has never been exposed to before. It's only in the last 100 years, really, since our food system became industrialized, that we're exposed to this stuff. And, since in the sort of post-World War II years of just like incredible explosion in plastics technology. And so if you think about, like, every single thing we come in contact with has, plasticizers in it. I mean, looking at this screen right now, what sort of fumes are coming off my laptop just talking to you, I did a commercial yesterday and they gave me a manicure, and I'm like, I got to get this nail polish off because I know the phthalates in it are like sinking into my nail bed. But I think that women are exposed, everybody's exposed from birth now. And women particularly are exposed even more because of things like cosmetics and hair dye. And they're the ones cooking, and they're the ones breathing in the fumes from the nonstick pans. And so I would not at all be surprised if there was a definitive link between those chemicals and autism. I mean, I can't say for sure because I am no authority, but how could it not be?
How could it not be? Yeah.
I'm Italian. I love to cook. So the culture for me has been and always will be very important to me, as the way I cook and the way my mom used to cook. And I love cooking Italian food. It's just a part of me. what is your cultural background and what was the role it played for you wanting to become a chef?
So my both of my parents are Eastern European Jews. My mom was born in Odessa, in Ukraine, in 1937, and my dad was born here. His grandparents were immigrants. They came here from like Lithuania, what was sort of on the border, Lithuania, Poland. So they came around the turn of the last century. So, my grandparents on his side were born here. He was born here, but my mom came here when she was 12. They were basically Holocaust refugees. They got out of Europe in the early 40s. They immigrated in 1949. So they sort of hid out in Uzbekistan during the war. And then they came here in 49. So, Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish food is not like one of the world's great cuisines. I hate to say it,
It's interesting though. It's interesting.
It's a cuisine of poverty and desperation mostly. And, there are some great things about it, the great rye bread and stuff like that. But, I would not say it's up there with the world's great cuisines. So my mom, she would occasionally make things like borscht or like stuffed cabbage, but it was not really a big part of our lives. But my parents were very into food, and growing up, like in the 70s, it was sort of this weird, like two-way trajectory. Like on one hand, the processed food explosion revolution was happening in the 70s, and everything was, canned soup and Pringles and like going that way. And then on the other hand, people were definitely sort of embracing this, like back to the earth, Mother Earth news, kind of post kind of hippie thing where, they were like, oh my God, what are we doing? What are we doing to our food? There was sort of these early, levels of awareness, like Francis Moore Lappé, who wrote Diet for a Small Planet. That's when that came out, things like that. And my parents were sort of more in that camp. Like we had a big garden and they made their own pickles. And my mother used to, put up jam every year and preserve. Like we lived on Long Island, but pretty far out. And there was still a lot of farms out there back then. It was like very agricultural. So like we would go picking, we'd pick strawberries, we would pick peaches, we would pick, apples and the seasons, and then always do all that. So they were really into all that stuff. And so that kind of exposed me in a way to a lot of the more traditional, ways of processing your food and growing it and stuff like that. But then my parents got divorced and the whole thing fell apart. And then it was like frozen dinners and Diet Coke.
Hamburger helper.
Yeah. I mean, not quite. My mom was a really good cook. And so she didn't use things like that, but it was like, we all were just like, she was working. My sister and I were in high school, but she was a good cook. So there was always definitely this influence. And the town I grew up in was a university town. And so there was a decent amount of diversity compared to, now it's super everywhere, super diverse. But back then, the fact that it was a fairly diverse town, that also helped because there were restaurants and markets and people, bringing other food ideas into the community. So that's kind of where it all started for me. Like as a little kid, I wouldn't say that it was any sort of cultural influence, like growing up Italian or something. It was more of the time and just having parents who were fairly sophisticated about food and their friends who were more sophisticated about food. So that's
cared. It sounds like they cared.
Briefly, yeah. While their marriage was still okay, they cared. Yeah. And also I was kind of a little fat kid, so I was obsessed with food, so that's like all I thought about really. So that's where it came from.
When you first started studying food, did something come to you? You know how like we get downloads, like, I want to go in this direction because of what you were exposed to as you started studying.
I mean, I guess what has kind of been the sort of overarching theme and what's come to me was that Americans, up until very recently, really had no food culture at all because we're such a young country and we're so many different immigrant groups. And you may have like sort of been raised in a family that did something very specific, but it's not like if you're from Italy, if you're Italian and live in Italy, or France or any other country in the world, Vietnam, Ghana, like whatever. It's like, you're like, my people have been here for thousands and thousands of years. This is who we are. This is our food culture. It's evolved with us, over time, whether we've been invaded, colonized, whatever, it's a very, very deep level of food consciousness and food culture that people draw on. And it's like a part of them. It's like, it's in their cells. Here, it's like we all just showed up, like in the last couple hundred years, and everyone sort of brought their own ideas. And then you overlap that with like this incredibly industrialized food system, that just strips the life out of everything. And so that's what started to really dawn on me over, sort of the first few years in my career was like, we really have no food culture here at all. And people, we need to create one. And I think now, 25 years later, it's actually, there's been a huge revolution in food in the US, just in the, since I started cooking professionally. It's amazing. I did a big freelance job in the spring for a company, and it took me all around the country. Like we flew to a lot of smaller cities, where I was like, oh, the food's going to be terrible. It's going to suck. And we went to places, like Bentonville, Arkansas, and Cincinnati, and San Antonio, and like all these sort of smaller cities. And we had unbelievably great food. Like I was so surprised. And that's like my New York snobbishness, of like, well, there's nothing here, but things have really, really, really changed. I mean, Americans are way tuned in to food now, whether it's food media and the Food Network and whatever, but, like we are really having like a food revolution in this country, at least in a certain demographic. I always like to preface that by saying like, those who can afford it are enjoying the fruits of that. And then people who can't afford that are getting more and more and more sick and eating worse and worse and worse stuff, because the poorer you are, the less access you have to high quality, good, healthy food. Actually, today at the White House, they had the big food summit. It was the first time since 1969 that they brought in thought leaders and farmers and chefs and educators to finally talk about what's wrong with our food system. First one since 1969 today. But, the rates of diabetes and heart disease are off the charts. 1 in 2 Americans is diabetic now. 50% of the population is diabetic. And diabetes is a food-related, food-caused disease. Like that's what makes people diabetic, is eating too much processed white carbs, white sugar, soybeans, corn, all of that stuff. And it's because, a lot of people are poor, and that's the cheap, plentiful food that fills you up. And if you live in a food desert where you don't have access to, a Whole Foods, or you don't have the resources to shop there, you're going to shop at Dollar Tree. And what do they sell at Dollar Tree? Shelf-stable packaged shit.
You're absolutely right, actually. I mean, it's really astonishing. I mean, it's so astonishing that you get angry, right? Because you see people out there who don't have the means to buy organic. And you brought this up in your Let's Get Real show many, many years ago, right? Like a family who's trying to feed, 4 or 5 kids, they're not going to go out and spend, I think you said $8 on organic eggs or go
Organic
to
eggs,
organic market.
I mean, but it's like not even organic. Like you don't even need organic. It's like, if you don't have access to a store that sells anything fresh, you're not going to eat anything fresh. And if your food dollar is stretched to the limit, you're much more likely to go and buy like a family-sized meal deal at a fast food place, than you are going to be able to go to the supermarket and shop and go home and cook. And going to the supermarket and shopping and cooking is also presuming that you have a car that can take you there, that you live in a home with a functioning kitchen, that you're equipped to do it, or even that you have time, because people who work, crazy hours and maybe 2 or 3 jobs and have little kids and have to deal with childcare and everything. Like, they don't have time to cook. All this goes back to like how we just lack like all the just fundamentally basic utter services in this country. We don't have childcare. We don't have guaranteed health care for people. Our minimum wage is a joke. It's like that social safety net is so porous and so pathetic that, the last thing that a really hardworking mom making minimum wage and trying to, take care of a couple of kids is going to do is like, go to a supermarket and buy stuff and come home and cook at 7 o'clock at night, when she just needs to feed her kids. And cheap processed food makes people full really fast. But unfortunately, it also makes them really sick really fast.
Yeah. I mean, the unfortunate thing is that you don't see that right away. It's this accumulative effect that's building up in your body year after year until one day it's like, bang.
And it's generational, so you have genetic predispositions for disease. And a lot of disease like that is also really exacerbated by stress. And, now we know, there's that book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's like, we know that trauma, intergenerational trauma is genetic and people pass it along. And a response to trauma is to, self-soothe. And how do people self-soothe? They smoke, they drink, they do drugs, and they eat things like Pringles because it makes them feel good.
Yeah. And I also think too, I mean, one of the things that I have noticed is that your palate, right, it gets attuned to things.
Oh, completely. Yes.
So when I was living in Europe and eating, much healthier than I eat here, and I came back and I can't even remember the brand, but it's on every shelf. It still is. And it's an iced tea brand. Big, they sell them in these big plastic.
Oh, yeah, like Arizona. Yeah.
I think it's one of those. And I remember drinking some, right after getting back from Europe, and it tasted like cardboard. I mean, because I hadn't had it in so long and I had been eating fresh food, my palate had forgotten, right? This processed taste, and it just tasted so toxic.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned all the food, especially in New York. There's food everywhere, pizza everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think of a lot of times I work with children, and a lot of times they do have eating disorders, they're very specific on certain types of food. Unfortunately, the parents will go out to these fast food chains and buy them certain types of food, and that's all they like.
Yeah.
And, I work in the Hispanic population, and I will ask them, I said, well, what do you do in your country when there is no McDonald's or Burger King or Pizza Hut? And I said, what do you give them? They said, well, they eat what we give them because that's all they have. And I thought to myself, well, then give them only the good stuff. Give them the healthy stuff, and don't take them to these chain restaurants. Yeah. And I think that's part of our culture that we have to try to change.
Yeah. Well, for immigrant populations, it's assimilation. It's like trying to fit in and trying to be American, and it's seen as a sign of success that you're making enough money that you can eat at these places where, if you look back at your home country and all you ate was rice and beans, you think like, oh, that's like poor people food, except rice and beans is like the best thing you can eat, But what also happens is the food industry has sold, the Western world on this idea that babies need to eat baby food. Like we all, have been completely brainwashed and sold and marketed this idea of like babies can only eat these purees and starting them on rice cereal and those little toddler puff. That is all just 100% processed white grains, white sugar, like awful, awful stuff. If you look at people who raise children in more traditional cultures, they just take whatever they're eating and mash it up and give it to the baby. Like in Korea, it's traditional. A baby's first food is to eat rice and kimchi. Here, a baby's first food is literally processed rice cereal from Gerber that is just mainlining sugar. And if you start feeding it starts with formula, and I know women, a lot of women can't breastfeed. It's medical, physical, economic. Like I'm not at all saying anything about formula, but formula, I always used to say it's the foodiness indoctrination food. It's like babies who are formula raised, bottle raised, their palates are more highly calibrated for sweet and salt and processed, because that's the first thing they've tasted. When babies drink breast milk, they're tasting everything that the mom is eating. So they're getting this wide array of flavors in the breast milk, and formula fed babies aren't, and then you graduate them from formula into that like rice cereal or like a little jar of something strained and pureed. And then those toddler puffs that are literally just, puffs of like processed rice or soybeans or corn with sugar. And all you're doing is creating this palate that's totally calibrated for processed industrialized food. And that's what the food industry wants, is they want to hook you at birth, so like, that's why on the show, we used to say baby formula was, the original foodiness food that you started out with. And then it just sets the tone from there. And kids who are raised on that sort of stuff, they're not adventurous eaters. They're not willing to try stuff. And they develop issues with texture because they're not given things to chew. Like babies, even without teeth, should be given soft pieces of food that they can gum, because they need to start understanding texture and learning how to process it in their mouth, and their palate forms around that. And it's this like infantilization that we do with, just this constant level of puree. And then, it just goes from there. And, you set the tone as an infant, and then people's palates are just, calibrated for that. And then, of course, that's all they're going to want to eat.
You're absolutely right. Especially like a child I was seeing today was, when I was working with him, he held his food in his mouth. And I said to the mom, he has food in his mouth. And because he holds it into his mouth, he doesn't swallow it. So the mom, because she doesn't chew anything really, he just sucks the juice out of everything. She has a tendency to, in a lot of cultures, to liquefy everything that they have, which doesn't allow them to understand how to chew.
Yeah.
Bolus on the tongue.
Yeah.
Trigger a swallow back. And so it's an ongoing
cycle. It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's too bad it's like that.
Yeah. I mean, and you can't really blame the moms. I'm sure they're very stressed out about
They
it.
are.
And, they just want their kid they don't want their kid to starve. And so they'll do whatever they can, to get food into the kid. But
yeah, and they don't realize what's actually happening, and it's interesting because we talked about demographics, and I think about the awareness that I've had for so long around food. And so there's this thinking, I feel, that among a certain demographic, well, we're eating healthy, we're eating organic food, we're buying organic, we're eating healthy. But I'll tell you something. It's interesting because even though we do eat organic all the time, we try to do farm to table, sustainable stuff wherever we go. I remember about 6 years ago or 7 years ago now, I went to Iceland on a business trip and ended up being there for a month. And I remember as a travel writer, I was getting hosted at all the restaurants in Iceland for free, which was great because Iceland is really expensive to eat.
yeah, very.
It's really expensive to eat.
Yeah, I know.
So I was getting hosted at all these incredible restaurants and was meeting all these amazing chefs, but I hadn't had any fast food because I don't eat fast food. I just, I haven't had fast food in a really long time. The day before I left Reykjavik, there was a fast food, kind of looked like a burger hut, right in the middle of the square. And I said, I'm going to try this because, I've been doing fine dining for 3 weeks. I'm kind of curious.
Mm-hmm.
And my $28 burger was fabulous. And I remember sitting there eating it and thinking, it was lamb, by the way, lamb burger. That's all they had. That's all they were serving. And I thought, what is it that's familiar? I can't put my finger on it. The burger tasted like the burgers did when I was a child.
Mm-hmm.
Before we had the chemicals, so there was a memory. It was almost like my palate remembered it. And there was this feeling of like, wow, that's far, and here I thought, interesting, you use the word calibrate. I would have thought my palate would have been calibrated to a healthy diet. And yet when I tasted that, there was a memory. just had how far our burgers had come, right? From being real meat to like processed meat. I mean, it was such a good burger. I couldn't believe it.
But what is your take on, or can we spoke about, processed foods and meat, but what is your take on now the meat that is not meat, but
Right.
it is?
Lab grown meat.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not a fan.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's going to save the planet. I think that it's more damaging than meat, because to source the ingredients to make those products requires so much more energy and water and shipping in of different ingredients and processing and freezing and packaging. And I used to say this on the show, to make like a meatless burger requires like 40 different ingredients, and each of those ingredients is grown in a different place and then picked and packaged and harvested and frozen and shipped and then repackaged and frozen and processed and packaged and shipped. And it's like, or you could just kill a steer and grind up. Now, the meat agriculture is incredibly damaging to the planet. We know that. And the world, especially the Western world, eats way too much meat and way too much industrially raised cheap meat. But I don't think the answer is something like the Impossible Burger, like these lab grown products, because it's not food to me. It's about as far away from food as you can get. And I think it's like vegan greenwashing of our food. Yeah. It's foodiness, basically it's just another processed product. I think the answer is that we all eat a lot less meat and a lot better meat, right? So if I'm going to eat meat, it's not going to be cheap supermarket meat, that's from feedlot animals, meaning, animals that have been raised in an enclosed space where they're basically force-fed grain and soybeans and corn and expired candy and corn syrup and whatever the meat industry can shove into them to make them fat. I'm going to eat good, local, grass-fed meat that's 4 times the price, but I'm only going to eat it once a month or something, instead of, the average American diet where people eat meat, 5 out of 7 nights a week or something. I don't know what the stats are, but, like an incredibly high amount of meat consumption. And that's because we've cheapened our meat to the point where people can do that. So to me, the answer is get rid of the industrial feedlot system, go back to a grazing system, because grazing is regenerative to the land. And it's like this perfect system of cattle grazing on the grass, pooping on the grass, fertilizing the grass, more grass grows, you move the cattle to a new field, you let that pasture regenerate for a couple of years. It's how it always used to be done, but eat a lot less, Yeah. Like it's the thing about the $8 eggs, like what are your priorities? Where do you want to put your food dollar? And this is all coming from a place of, white middle-class privilege. Like that's why I can say this, because I have never felt extreme poverty, like I can afford it. But if you can afford to make those choices, those are the choices that you should make is, eat better and eat less of that sort of stuff.
Eat better and eat less.
Yeah. Like Europe, if you think about it, when we go to Europe and you go to a restaurant, you're not loading up on,
portions are much smaller.
Much smaller, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All around the world, portions are much smaller than in the US. We eat a huge amount of food and we waste an incredible amount of food. I mean, look how much food gets thrown away in restaurants every day. We throw away 40% of the food that's produced in the US. Some of it is just left in the fields because it just simply can't be harvested because it's imperfect or there's no market for it or whatever. Or now, there's like nobody to pick it all, or these like massive plates of food in restaurants where people throw out half of it, or you bring home your leftovers, but then 5 days later you throw them away. People go shopping, you go to Costco, you buy everything in bulk, and then 2 weeks later, it's all rotting in your fridge and we throw it away. It's 40% of our food. And when food is put in landfill, when organic matter, food waste is put in landfill, it decomposes anaerobically So it creates methane, and it's one of the biggest contributors of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is food rotting in landfills. So like, at least if you're going to throw away your food, compost it, try to find a composting system in your town, or, see if your town does it. Like now in New York, we have municipal composting, which is great. I actually just took mine down before to the bucket. But, when food waste is put into compost, that's regenerative. Compost gets turned back into soil. The soil goes back into the earth, and it's good. You sort of recapture those lost nutrients into the earth. Yeah, I mean, we don't need to eat the amount of food that we're served here, or that it's insane. Like buffets, to me, are like the most disgusting thing because there's so much waste on a buffet. It's like sickening.
Well, and you always end up eating more than you need. Always.
Right. And I mean, look at America. Half the adults in America are severely obese. And that's because we have this incredibly abundant source of super cheap food. And it's not doing anybody any favors.
So is there a foundation of where you start people with, so it's not just teaching them to cook, it's really also how to think about food.
Yeah. I mean, when I taught culinary school, the kind of introductory module, the first month, we tried to incorporate a lot of that stuff, or at least I tried to really incorporate, we did food history and stuff like that, and some nutrition, but not that much. Maybe they do it now there. I haven't been there since actually 2013. I left that job right when I came to do TEDx, literally like a month before that. No, I mean, the classes that I teach now, the recreational classes, are either like single subject classes, like how to cook duck, or, it'll be like a knife skills class, or I do a 6-week skills intensive boot camp. So we meet once a week, and each week is a different sort of set of skills and techniques. But I try to incorporate all of these ideas when I'm teaching. So, right from day one, I tell them, that what I'm looking to do is teach them to be more instinctive cooks, to be more ingredient driven and less recipe driven, to learn how to identify what's in season, so that when you go to the market, you can see what's in season, you can see what looks good, and then you can say, oh, I know how to do this, so if it's May, it'll be asparagus, and I know what to do with the asparagus. But if it's, October, I'm not going to look for asparagus because it's so out of season, and it's going to be, butternut squash or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, I try to incorporate all of that in every lesson. It's not like there's some sort of intro fundamentals thing. It all just, it's all intertwined for me.
But it's interesting you use the word kind of your instinct, right? Your instinct. I mean, it was interesting. You remember when we went to that cooking class in Oakland, actually, and it was a French chef, and he was just, he was funny. He was getting out all the fruits and the vegetables. And he said, if you're going to buy something, whether it's at a market, a fresh market, or in a store, if you're looking at stuff that looks dead and it doesn't look fresh, I mean, it was just basic common sense, right? If it's brightly colored and your carrots are vivid and they're speaking to you, then, there's a connection there. And it's really logical, right? But it's not, kind of like what you've been saying all along, we're not trained or conditioned to think that way.
Not at all. So, yeah, I mean, kids are not, I think they're starting to be. There are a lot of programs in schools now that are doing this. So it's great. And I think we are turning a corner in a lot of places. But like I said, we don't have the thousands and thousands of years of food culture, supporting us that people in any place but the US do. So we don't have that, like, just, very long strand of connectedness to, through our ancestry to our food in a specific place, and understand, like if you grow up in Italy, if you grow up in Rome, what you grow up eating and understanding about food and recognizing as seasonal is going to be completely different than what somebody like up in Emilia Romagna grows up eating. It's very local. It's very specific to that region. It's very regional cuisine. We have some of that in the US, but not too much. But if you don't grow up with a family that sort of understands that and teaches that to you, how are you going to know? Because you go into your average supermarket and everything is there. Like, you have no idea what's in season or it's like you just have everything. The fact that we can buy tomatoes all year round, is insane. Tomatoes are only in season. Like here in the Northeast, tomato season started in August and it's basically over now.
Yeah.
But I can go into any store and buy tomatoes anytime I want. They're going to suck, but
And wax.
yeah. And it's amazing. I get students who are literally, they say to me, I don't know what's in season. I have no idea what's in season now. And like, to me, that's so hard to fathom because I'm so tuned into it, but I get it. You weren't taught, you don't know.
Yeah, that is amazing. I mean, that's really basic,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your students because you've been teaching for a long time now. Do you see that the students that you're teaching now are a little bit more conscious of their food, of how they cook and what they cook with?
Absolutely. Yes, people are much more aware. Food media has exploded in the last 20, 25 years. Writings about food. I mean, social media has done it, but yeah, I think people are really getting much more tuned in to where your food comes from, how it's produced, who's growing it, what went into producing it. I mean, especially post-COVID, when people were locked in their houses and had to start cooking for themselves and started learning about it, and then understanding supply chain issues, or like now, if you have noticed, prices of certain things have gone way up, like anything bread related, flour, anything baked, because almost all the grain that we use comes from Ukraine. Like Ukraine supplies like a huge amount of the world's grain, and it's not coming here now, so like, that's why, my husband went to the deli and got a sandwich and it was $17 and he was horrified. And I said, it's the grain, because it's not just the grain being used to make the bread, it's the grain that's being grown also to feed the animals. And so everything is more expensive because of that.
Everything's interconnected.
Everything is interconnected. Russia produces almost all the fertilizer used in the world, and they're not making any now because of this war. And so we're heading for like a major farming crisis in the next year because there's no fertilizer on the world market.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was on a press trip to France, I guess maybe 7 years ago now. And we were visiting a lot of the farmers. And I noticed that I'm not lactose intolerant, but I noticed that when I have, even if it's organic milk or any dairy product in this country, my stomach's off a little bit. I mean, I can handle it, right? I can handle it, but it's off. There's something that I notice, or my skin might break out. And if I go to Europe, right, I don't have that problem at all. And what I found interesting is that the farmers in France, at least in the areas that we were visiting, and this was in Normandy and Brittany, that they were willing to take a cut in their revenues and not buy into all the chemicals that they were being forced into. And they felt very strongly about that. And I think that really plays into a little bit about what we've been talking about with culture, right? I mean, culture, it's so important for French people, their food.
Yeah,
right?
well, they value their food. I mean, food has a much deeper meaning to them. It's the value. And it's what I said, it's this really deep connection to your food and, and your food culture and where it comes from.
Yeah. And I think, personally, I think, I lived on a kibbutz when I was, 19 years old. And, it was amazing because everybody had to go through the cycle of different jobs on the kibbutz. So I milked cows and I picked green gages and I picked oranges and, was on the field with the tractors and all of that, and worked in the kitchen. One of my jobs was sitting there just throwing onions into a thing for like 3 hours in the morning. But, everybody had this collective responsibility, it seemed like, on the farm to bring really healthy food to the kibbutz. And every day we ate healthy and meals lasted. We didn't like jump in and grab breakfast and leave. There was this communion around food. And I think it's the same in France and it's the same in Italy. And, that's something that was really, really hard for me moving back from Europe to the States. We used to have these 3-4 hour meals, and in the States, you're kind of like you're in and you're out, right?
Well, that's because of, our approach to work. I mean, we don't value our lives in the same way that people in other countries value their lives. And what we prioritize is different. We're all about profit and we're all about capitalism and making money and not enjoying your life and just, working as hard as you can until you drop dead. And so we don't prioritize the time to sit down and have meals because we don't care. It's not a part of our culture.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame that,
in France and in Italy, and I'm sure in many other European countries, when the kids have lunch, they sit down at little tables, they have real plates, they have real silverware. They're actually fed like a real, cooked meal, multi-course meal. And they have to sit there and they have to learn how to use a knife and fork, and they have to eat the meal. And there's the lunch ladies there who hover over them and help them out, make sure they eat it. And it's, it'll be poached salmon and vegetables, and they'll have a little piece of cheese, and it's real food. And they get graded on their eating. That's a subject is lunch.
Wow, that's amazing. I did not know that. That's amazing.
Yeah. And if, they're not eating well or, something, they'll call the parent and they'll say, little Pierre is, refusing to eat such and such, what's going on with him? And, not in a punitive or punishing way, but it's we're concerned because your kid isn't eating the way they should be eating. Yeah. And it's an hour of sitting down and eating.
Yeah. Well, it's like that when I was a foreign exchange student as well. I remember that, it was a big part of the culture.
Yeah.
Everywhere you went. I did not know about that though. I do remember having an experience doing a shuttle flight from Switzerland to Italy. And I think it was an hour flight, and they were serving bruschetta. I couldn't believe it. I remember, I think I must have taken 100 pictures of it because I was just so astonished on this short flight that we had such good food.
Yeah.
Speaking about a lot of cultures, especially in America, what do you see now is America's food culture at this point where we are? Have we
sum it up? There's 100 different things going, it all depends on affluence and race and where you are in
it's too much of a mishmash. It's too much.
Yes. We're such a mix here of people and ideas and cultures that I can't answer that. I think in some ways we're heading in the right direction. People are becoming very aware and tuned into food. And in some ways we're sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into the processed pile of shit. And, more and more people are overweight and diabetic and having food related, diet related diseases. A lot of it depends on who's in the White House too.
Yeah, it does.
When the Obamas were in the White House, they tried really, really hard to revamp the school lunch program. And as soon as they were out of the White House, it all got scrapped, because big food is so powerful and the lobbyists are so powerful, and they control the USDA and they control the Republicans, and all the farm states grow all the soybeans and all the corn. And that's what our entire food system is based on. And, we subsidize the corn growers, but only something like 4% of farm subsidies go to actual vegetable farmers.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. Yeah.
So it's really hard to say. The fact that they had this food summit today at the White House is pretty incredible, but let's see what happens in the midterms, because all that progress could just be wiped out in one day.
That's the problem, right? 4 years, right? Yep. It takes that much time just to get something implemented. And then the next administration wants to unravel everything.
Yeah, they'll just wipe it out. It just all depends on how deeply in bed they are with big food and big pharma. And big pharma and big food go hand in hand, because big food creates the problem and big pharma provides the drugs to try to fix the problem. And they don't fix it. They just keep medicating people, and big food keeps making them sicker. And it's, they're just like
in bed together and making a lot of money in the process of that vicious cycle of keeping Americans sick.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So we're running out of time, but before we get, that's okay. This has just been a riveting conversation and going in directions we didn't even anticipate. But before we close, I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about your funny people making food, which moves us out of the, kind of Debbie Downer that we've been in about the state of our food.
It's all been very dark.
No, that's okay. I think it's very important for people who are watching to know what's going on and to hear your perspective, because you're entrenched in it, and they might know about some of the stuff, but not everything. We certainly didn't. So the thing about funny people making food, why did you do it? And did it start as part of COVID? Was that?
No, actually started it in 2017. So
okay.
It's been a while.
Before COVID.
Yeah. So I was doing some comedy writing and a little bit of stand-up and stuff like that. And I've always incorporated a lot of comedy into my teaching. When you stand up in front of a class and you lecture for half an hour, you have to keep them engaged. And so I always felt like I was kind of doing a stand-up routine when I was teaching. And so Jerry Seinfeld has this show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, that I loved. And I was watching one day and I thought, I could do the same exact thing. I could just meet up with comedians in their home kitchen and we could just hang out and cook and talk. And it would be so much more interesting than just drinking coffee. So I got in touch with a couple of comedians that I knew, and I found a little production team and I self-funded it. And I said, let's do this. And so we have 6 different guests. We created 6 full-length episodes, and it was very expensive because I self-funded it. And we had a great time with it. So it's basically, I go into the home kitchen of whoever the guest is going to be on that episode, and we hang out and we cook and we talk about food, and we talk about whether their food life influences their comedy life or not at all. Some people, yes. And some people are just like, nope, 2 totally separate things, but it doesn't matter. It's still really fun. And each episode has a little bit of like a little funny kind of gimmick or like a little backstory. So we shot all 6 of them, I think. We shot literally the last 2 the week of like March 10th of 2020. So we were joking in one of the episodes, we were like joking about like, oh, ha, 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 what if we have to go into quarantine? And I was like, oh my God, it could be like 6 weeks. And then the world blew up. But so what I started to do on Instagram was take the full length episodes, because the episodes are like 22 minutes, and just chop them up into tiny little clips and put them up on Instagram. So you can watch, these little like mini 30-second Instagram reels, because, as fun as it is to do a 22-minute episode, doing a 30-second reel on Instagram is a lot faster. And people don't have any attention span. So that's all they want to watch. But so if you go to Instagram, it's just at Funny People Making Food. And so along with the clips from the episodes, I'm also now putting up daily, just little videos of, how to cut an onion, how to, do whatever, peel garlic, like just little tiny instructional things, just really basic stuff that people don't necessarily know how to do. And, there are a million people on social media doing cooking videos, but there's room for one more. So I thought, why not?
So any parting words, Sunshine, before we close?
Oh, man. I mean, just, figure out how much food, figure out what your priorities are with food. Like what I always say to people is like, when, if I go to the farmer's market to buy my eggs and those eggs are $8 for a dozen, somebody will say to me, oh my God, you spend $8 a dozen on eggs. I can get a dozen eggs for, $2.99. And I say to them, well, think about what goes into the production of those eggs. Think about the lives of the hens. Think about what they were fed. Think about where, they were raised, the food they were given. Think about the people who have to be paid to do it, and then break it out on a per egg basis. And you're still getting like 6 or 12 meals out of that for $8. So if you think about it, $8 is actually really cheap for eggs. And then what I always say to people is, okay, so if you think $8 for a dozen eggs is too much, how much did you spend on your last drink at Starbucks?
Yeah.
Right? $6
Well
for a
said.
cup
Yeah.
of
Well said.
ice and coffee and sugar, lots and lots of sugar.
Lots
Or
of sugar.
how much did you spend on your last cocktail? Cocktails here in New York now are $18, right?
Yes, here.
2 ounces of, mixer, a little liquor, and an ice cube. So, it's all about priorities, right? It's like, how much, what does food mean to you? How much do you value it? And then, figure that out, and then put the money literally there, put your money where your mouth is, because like nothing is more important than what you feed yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say, it's not about like the value of food. It's the value of you.
Yeah. It's your life, and chronic disease that is, directly connected to what you're eating, and not even just disease, but your mood, like depression. So much of the depression in this country could be alleviated by people just changing their diets. If you eat diets very high in processed carbohydrates, you're much more prone to depression. And, we could fix a lot of that just by changing the food prescription, basically.
And fatigue.
Yeah, all of it.
I always have a lot of energy, a ton of energy, but it's because of what I put in my body.
Yeah, right. Me too. And I can feel it. If I don't, if I'm on the road, I eat unwell for a few days, I can feel it.
We will definitely let people know about all the ways to contact you and how to tune into your funny people making food, as well as anything else that you're working on. So how fun this was. Thank you for being with us. And hopefully next time we are in Brooklyn, we will eat together.
Yeah, for sure. Okay.